Hello and welcome to Psychology. On a weekly basis, I will be using the Nelson PowerPoint slides that accompany our textbook to provide you with an overview of important themes and subject and concepts. This week, we'll go over Chapter 1, The Evolution of Psychology. The development of psychology moves from speculation to science, and prior to 1879, psychology did not exist as an independent field of study. Psychological questions arose on a secondary basis out of the fields of philosophy and physiology. Wilhelm Wundt campaigned to make psychology an independent discipline, and he brought about the scientific methods of philosophy and physiology and developed the first laboratories in psychology at the University of Leipzig in 1879. Wilhelm Wundt had international influence, and many young scholars came to Leipzig to study under Wundt. Wundt's students trained in the scientific study of the mind, and then dispersed across Germany and America. The first research lab in the US was established by G. Stanley Hall, who studied under Wundt briefly at Johns Hopkins University. Between 1883 and 1893, 24 new psychological laboratories sprang up in the US and Canada. While psychology was born in Germany, its period of largest growth began in the United States. And you can see here where all of these laboratories sprang up at universities across the United States. Two intellectual schools of thought regarding the science of psychology fought it out in the academic arena, with the fight led by Edward Titchener in the structuralism camp and James in the functionalism corner. The structuralists believed that psychology should be about analyzing consciousness into basic elements, just as physicists were studying how matter was made up in basic particles. To do this, Titchener and his followers relied on introspection, a process by which a person makes careful, systematic self-observations of one's own conscious experience. The functionalists thought this missed the point, and James and his followers thought psychology should be about investigating the function or purposes of consciousness rather than its structure. So who won this battle? Well, probably the functionalists, although the war changed as both schools of thought gradually decreased. The reality is that today most psychologists aren't really categorized as functionalists or structuralists, but rather modern fields of applied psychology and behaviorism are direct descendants of functionalism. So basically, the battle of the schools was only a prelude to numerous fundamental controversies that followed in psychology, which we will discuss in this chapter and the next. It was the advent of behaviorism in the 1900s that was the next major school of thought to fundamentally alter the course of psychology. And a lot of what we do today in terms of working with people and shaping behaviors are rooted in that behaviorism paradigm. Behaviorism makes his debut in the period of John B. Watson, who founded this school of thought. The basic tenet of behaviorism and Watson was that only observable behavior should be studied in scientific psychology. And that behavior, according to Watson, refers to observable or overt responses or activity to an organism. Watson's ideas radically changed the landscape of psychology, and really they gave up this idea of consciousness and have a more scientific science of behavior. And as you can see here, John Watson and this idea of nature and nurture is really what Watson talks about. Give me a dozen healthy infants, well-informed, and my own special world to bring them up in, and I'll guarantee to take any one at random and train him or her to become any type of specialist I might select. a doctor, a lawyer, an artist, a merchant, a chef, and yes, even a beggar man and a thief. Watson not only proposed a fundamental change to the focus of psychology, but he also took a strong stand on one of the oldest questions in psychology, and that is, are we who we are because of nature or nurture? Watson argued strongly for nurture, and our famous quote that I've read really speaks to his beliefs. While this really oversimplified his stance, his writings did contribute to strong environmental slant and associated with the behavioralist school of thought. In addition, the focus of behavioral psychology was on the relationship between the stimuli in the environment and the responses by the organism or of the organism, a stimuli response psychology, or we call it an SR psychology, clearly putting emphasis on the environment or nurture in behavior. Sigmund Freud brings the unconscious into the picture. Freud was an Austrian physician who founded psychoanalytic psychology. Sigmund Freud, his emphasis was on this unconscious process that influenced behavior. He worked with people with psychological problems and led him to believe that people are influenced by their unconscious forces, that is, their thoughts, their memories, their desires that are outside of conscious awareness. Freud's ideas are really controversial and influential. Freud believed that the unconscious conflict, particularly with regard to sexual urges, plays a central role in human behavior. At the time, this was scandalous and offensive for several reasons. First, if we are influenced by forces we are not aware of, how can we be masters of our own minds? Where does free will come from? And second, in an era of sexual repression, remember Freud, his period of time is at the turn of the century, the emphasis on sexuality was quite upsetting to many people. The controversial nature of Freud's ideas caused great resistance in the field of psychology, and his ideas were not really received well by academic circles. And despite, or maybe even because of the controversy, Freud's ideas moved into the mainstream, influencing thought in psychology and medicine and art and literature, and attracted very many prominent followers such as Carl Jung and Alfred Adler. Skinner championed a return to strict focus on observable behavior, and he didn't deny that mental events exist, just that they can't be studied scientifically and therefore they're outside the realm of the science of psychology. Fundamental principle is that the organisms tend to repeat responses that follow to positive outcomes and vice versa, negative outcomes. Skinner trained animals using this principle with much success, and later his followers showed that it also works with humans. He stirred up controversy in the early 1970s when he published Beyond Freedom and Dignity, asserting that all behavior is governed by external stimuli and that people are controlled by their environments, not themselves, and that actually a free will as a concept is an illusion. The 1950s showed opposition to psychoanalytic theory and behaviorism with charges that both were dehumanizing, and the humanists revolt. While behaviorism and psychoanalytic theory dominated mainstream psychology, most people had a hard time believing that people are not masters of their own fate. The anti-Freud Skinner crowd formed a loose alliance that eventually became a new school of thought called humanism that was led by Abraham Maslow and Carl Rogers. Humanism focused on unique qualities in humans, especially their free will and the potential for personal growth, and had a very optimistic view of human nature. James Mark Baldwin was born in South Carolina and received his PhD from Princeton University, and also worked in Leipzig in Wilhelm Wundt's Lamb. And really, this is the first experimental laboratory in the British Empire that's established by Baldwin at the University of Toronto in 1891. Brenda Milner of McGill University made crucial contributions to psychology in the areas of memory and neuropsychology, and Canadian Psychological Association was founded in 1939. Important contributions also are led by Donald Hebb from McGill University, who received his PhD from Harvard and published a seminal book called The Organization of Behavior a neuropsychological theory in 1949. And this book challenged the then dominant behaviorist models and set the stage for contemporary developments in cognition and neuroscience. Psychology comes to age as a profession as clinical psychology deals with the diagnosis of and treatment of psychological problems and disorders. And after World War II, many academic psychologists had to become clinicians to treat soldiers that were suffering from trauma. And this validated the clinical psychology paradigm as an important and applied discipline. What about cognition and neuroscience and psychology? Cognition is really the mental processes involved in acquiring knowledge. Cognition involves thinking or conscious experience. The dominance of behavioralist thought significantly decreased with the advent of cognitive psychology. Theorists such as Jean Piaget, who studied the development of cognition, or Noam Chomsky, who studied the psychological underpinnings of language, and Herbert Simon and colleagues who studied problem solving, paved a new path in psychology by using scientific method, a way beyond introspection for studying cognitive processes. Some researchers argue that cognitive psychology is now the dominant perspective in psychology. This is the application of scientific method to studying internal mental events, and psychology, cognitive psychology being this new dominant perspective. Let's look at the biological psychology, or the biological basis of behavior. Biological psychologists are interested in interrelations among the mind and the body and behavior. Advocates of the biological perspective maintain that much of our human and animal behaviors can be explained through the physiological processes that underlie the behavior. James Old, for example, in the 1950s demonstrated that animals could be made to experience emotions such as pleasure and rage through brain stimulations. Electrical stimulations of the brain evoked emotional responses in animals. And Roger Sperry in the 1980s demonstrated that the left and right halves of the brain have specialized functions and each handle different types of mental tasks. This left-right brain specialization, and we'll talk more about that left-right brain specialization as the course continues. Donald Hebb's ideas also suggested how neural networks work and how they're organized through what we call cell assemblies that describe neural networks. Historically, a focus on culture and diversity was absent from the disciplines of psychology. In fact, the vast majority of psychological research seeking to identify general principles of behavior that could be applied to all humanity has been conducted in the United States by white middle and upper class males studying with white middle class and upper class males. So little attention was paid historically to how research might apply to non-Western cultures, ethnic minorities, and women. In the late 1980s, however, a movement toward incorporating cultural factors into research and theory had emerged, and this was partly due to socio-political forces such as the strengthening of civil rights movements and women's rights in the late 1960s and 70s that took root and started to inform the disciplines such as psychology in the mid to late 1980s. But most notably, these were due to advances in international communication and this idea of global interdependence, as well as an increasingly human multicultural makeup of the Western world. We now move to the discussion of the emergence of evolutionary psychology. And the basic idea behind evolutionary psychology was not new. James and the functionalists were influenced by Darwin, and the 1960s and 70s brought breakthroughs in evolutionary biology that began to impact psychology in the late 1980s. David Buss, Martin Daly, Margot Wilson, led also by John Tooby, led the new evolutionary psychology movement. These researchers met at the Center for Advanced Study and Behavioral Sciences in the late 1990s to set an ambitious agenda for evolutionary psychology, and they basically gave life to the first new theoretical perspectives in psychology in a long time. While the perspective is gaining influence, many critics hold that the theory is untestable and, of course, based on post hoc accounts for obvious behavioral phenomena. Positive psychology studies positive emotional experience such as happiness, love, gratitude, contentment, and hope. It focuses on positive traits such as personal strengths and virtues such as courage and perseverance and tolerance and creativity, integrity, and kindness. It also looks at positive institutions in communities like strong family and work environments supporting neighborhoods and others. And this is a really promising area that influences how we work with human beings and how we can help people be well in their human condition. Psychology today is vigorous and diversified. Psychology is a science that studies behavior and the physiological and cognitive processes that underlie it. And it's a profession that applies the accumulated knowledge of this science to practical problems. The 9 major research areas in psychology are developmental, social, experimental, biological, cognitive, personality, health, educational, and psychometrics. The 4 major applied areas of specialization are clinical, counseling, which is what you are in, educational school, and industrial organizational. And you can see here a nice figure 1.5 that demonstrates the major research areas in contemporary psychology. I can note here that the predominant area is developmental psychology. And from a figure 1.6, we can see that the principal professional specialties in contemporary psychology lie in a predominance of clinical psychology with 72.1%. So let's put this whole lesson into perspective. And there are 7 key themes related to psychology as a field of study. The first is that psychology is empirical, meaning that empiricism is the premise that knowledge should be acquired through observation, and psychologists conduct scientific research to test their ideas. The theme number 2 is that psychology is theoretically diverse. A theory is a system or interrelated ideas to explain a set of observations, and in psychology we have many competing theories. For example, Freud would explain behavior in different terms than would Skinner, and there is often more than one way of looking at something. Number 3, that psychology evolves in a socio-historical context, meaning that psychology and other sciences are influenced by trends, issues, and values in society. So, for example, the rapid growth of clinical psychology was greatly influenced by the war-related surge in the demand for clinical services. In terms of themes related to psychology subject matter, behavior is determined by multiple causes. Behavior is governed by a complex network of interacting factors. For example, why will you make an A in psychology? Is it intelligence, study skills, memory, or motivation? Theme number 5 refers to culture as a widely shared customs, belief, values, norms, institutions, and other products of a community that are transmitted socially across generations. And culture factors influence and shape behavior and influence our interpretations of behavior. Finally, behavior is influenced jointly by hereditary and environment. Hereditary and environment interact to mold behavior in complex ways. It's not nature or nurture, but actually impact of nurture and nature, or nurture on nature, and vice versa. And lastly, theme number 7, motives and expectation influence people's experience. The scientific method is used to keep this from being a problem. I hope you enjoyed lesson 1, and I look forward to next week's lesson number 2.